What's going on, my friends? This is Dustin Stelzer with Electrician U. Today, we're going to talk about the story of Federal Pacific Electric Company. Before I get into this, all of you watching right now, please like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. There's 60% of you out there that watch all my videos and you don't subscribe. Quit being a taker. Give. Be a giver. Subscribe. And while you're at it, hit the little join button too. If you join the channel membership, you get a bunch of little extras. So you get little badges next to your name, depending on how long you've been a member too. They change the longer that you've been a member. You get special emojis. So if I do my chats, like every Friday, I do either a live or a Q&A. So in the chat, you get special little packs of emojis. You get to see when content is released before anybody else does. Any kind of new tools that I get, or just like a whole bunch of different posts and things. I put out extra content for those of you guys that are channel members. So check that out if you're interested. Federal Pacific is a company that made electrical panels and breakers. They were the Federal Pacific Electric Company, FPE. You'll see it abbreviated. So back in like the 40s, actually, I don't even know what the beginning of their company was. There's a lot of like disclosure agreements and things. You can't find a lot about this company out because the IP has been bought for this company by other companies. That's intellectual property. There's been a lot of like lawsuits and things that have happened over the years, so that it's kind of a muddy history of this company, but you can kind of see the traces of who bought who over the years and where these things have gone. So let's get into it. Back in 1949, Federal Pacific Electric Company got their first patent. In 1963, they actually got their patent for these stab lock breakers. Now, the stab lock system was one type of panel and breaker that they had, and this is the one that became problematic. So just remember the name stab lock. Really anything Federal Pacific is just needs to go down the shitter. But stab lock is really the important part. Then in 1969, these breakers were selling so well that a company named UV Industries bought Federal Pacific out. And this is, the 60s. During this time, there's a whole lot going on in our country and a whole lot going on in the world. So when I'm telling the story about how these companies were buying each other out, this was happening on a large scale everywhere. But homes were being built largely because like air conditioning systems were being invented. So now the entire southern United States, people could have air conditioning systems in their homes. This was post World War II, so like a lot of things, civil rights, a whole bunch of shit was happening in our world. And then globally things were happening too. It was all cooling down after World War II. So there was just an insane amount of infrastructure and things that were happening in the 60s. So these panels were being sold in mass, like huge amounts. And the company was doing really well. They were like being valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. And then in 1978, there's another company named Reliant Electric that bought out Federal Pacific from UV Industries. And then a few years later, it was 1979, Exxon, the big oil company, they bought Reliant, the whole company Reliant, for like $1.2 billion, which Reliant had the Federal Pacific breakers. So Exxon was doing a whole bunch of different things at the time. One piece of their business was this, but as soon as they got this company and they started looking at the product, they realized there was a problem, and a massive problem. So they started to look into a lot of these breakers and realize, like, holy shit, there's a problem with these. A lot of them just don't trip. And the whole thing that they're supposed to be doing, they have a UL listing on them that means that they are tested to ensure that they work, that they're going to prevent fires or anything happening from people. And they realized there was a problem. In 1980, Exxon sues UV Industries because they realized there's a problem with their products. So Reliant bought Federal Pacific, thinking everything was okay. They didn't test anything. There was nothing reported. But when Exxon took over, they had found some problems. And so they turned around to UV Industries and sued them, which got the attention of UL. And UL ended up taking all of the listings away for Federal Pacific. So now Federal Pacific was still a company and it was still able to operate, and they still continued to make breakers, even though all their listings had been taken away. And there was a whole bunch of like red tape and a bunch of disclosure agreements and things where nobody could get access to the actual testing that was happening. And Federal Pacific was out there saying like, oh, we were testing everything and we didn't find any problems, you know, like there's nothing wrong, and we don't have any data to share with anybody. So they were being really shady. And on top of them being shady about it, they just kept making the fucking breakers. In 1984, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, I fuck that up every time I say it, Consumer Product Safety Commission actually sat down and tested their products as well. And they found in some cases up to 60% of the products were faulty. Meaning 60% of the breakers that Federal Pacific was putting out in the stab lock line were actually faulty. A lot of them were like double pole breakers that only one pole would trip, and it would just, the handle would seize up and it wouldn't actually trip, you know, both handles. Some of the handles just wouldn't work altogether. So the mechanisms inside of the breakers were not actually being tested to the UL standard of that time. Now, it's also really important as a side note just to put in, UL didn't do testing, and for the most part doesn't do testing. A lot of times UL does what they kind of like come into your facility and they oversee your testing, or they did back in the day. It was heavily reliant on you testing your own products, and we're just going to come in with a clipboard and kind of oversee and make sure that your processes are all good, and then we're going to take off. So that was how it was able to be to happen. So UL was coming in and inspecting, but it was really inspecting the process by which Federal Pacific was saying that they were adhering to their standards when they really weren't. Now, after this whole Consumer Product Safety Commission thing came out with all of this data, Federal Pacific started to refuse and say like, oh, we don't know that there's any problem, like we don't agree with the findings. So nothing happened. You know, like this is the 60s, 70s, 80s, like there's not a whole lot of like legislature in place and codes and standards and stuff. All that stuff was really invented like right at the early 1900s. So this was kind of a loose cowboy era, and you know, things like this were happening everywhere else in a lot of other industries as well. So the lack of oversight is really just when these companies would find out there was a problem, they were just like, we're just gonna bet that it's not that bad. You know, like sure, maybe some of the products fail. We're just gonna let this ride and just hope that nothing bad happens. But they made the wrong bet. There's been tests done on their breakers that are tested on brand new breakers that were never installed, on breakers that were installed, on breakers that were removed from panels and put into trucks and taken out and tested. They went, like there's a guy named Dr. Ehrenstein that actually went through a whole bunch of these different breakers and actually did his own tests later on. And there's tons of papers that are published on the failure rates of all of these things. But the interesting part to note is that they still were putting breakers out for many, many years. It wasn't until 2002 that a court in New Jersey found that Federal Pacific had violated the New York Consumer Fraud Act by knowingly selling breakers that didn't meet the UL standards that they claimed, and they were still putting the UL listings on the package. So they got caught. And so this whole time, I mean, we're talking decades that all of these breakers were still going out. And even after 2002, there were other companies. So there were spin-off companies that when this company broke down, they broke into other companies, American Circuit Breaker and Federal Pioneer, and there's all these other different brands that were still manufacturing with the intellectual property in the same factories. They were still manufacturing these same breakers, and they were just putting different stickers on them. So this has been like kind of a crazy issue that we've just allowed to happen. So why is any of this important? Why would a company go to this length to just not fix their problem? Like, why wouldn't they just keep making these products? Well, when you think about it, they're manufacturing at a huge scale, nationwide, putting products in homes. They've already got all of these manufacturing processes, machines made specifically for all of this stuff, packaging, like all of the science and manufacturing and engineering is already done for this. So it's so hard to like go and change all of that stuff. But the other problem with it is inspectors won't pass inspections, or they shouldn't pass inspections with products that don't have a UL listing or some kind of listing. There's other listing agencies other than UL. UL usually sets the standard, and then other places like ETL can have listings as well. They have a very similar structure in how they evaluate and classify products to make sure that they're safe. But every product needs to be listed, and that's in the National Electric Code for electrical products specifically. So any electrical inspector out there that would go to a panel and be like, oh, all these Federal Pacific breakers don't have a UL listing, that would be a huge problem, right? So they just kept putting the listing on, so electricians would keep buying the products, and so inspectors would keep passing the products, even though they knew there was a massive problem. All circuit breakers have to adhere to a UL standard, and that's standard 489. Now, in 489 is like a long thing. It's like 100 pages long. There's a bunch of things that UL requires of circuit breakers. But the main three things that are important to talk about here are that breakers have to hold at 100% and trip at 135 and 200% of their rated current. So what that means is, say we have a 20 amp breaker. Well, if we run 20 amps of current through a 20 amp breaker, that's 100% of its rated current. It should hold. But if we run 27 amps through a 20 amp breaker, that's where it hits 135% of its rated current, and it should trip because it's simulating a thermal overload. And then the last thing is, if we run 40 amps through a 20 amp breaker, this would be 200% of its rated current, it should trip as well, and this would simulate a short circuit for this breaker. So those are the main things that we're looking for to make sure that a breaker does trip to adhere to its standard. Now, there's obviously not every single product that is made by every single manufacturer, run through every single facility, is going to be perfect. Because you're on an assembly line and you're manufacturing with machinery, you can't test every single one of your products that you're putting out. If you're putting out 500,000 products a year or 1 million products a year, you have to pick through the bunch every once in a while and just see quality assurance. Are these things being tested correctly? So there's a testing process that happens at the manufacturer level that makes sure that the manufacturers are creating products to the UL standard. But there's also the company itself that has to have an audit process. And that's not part of the UL requirement, that's just good manufacturing practice. So there's an audit that a lot of companies will do where they'll take in new stock and they will test it themselves and see if there's any kind of incongruency with the manufacturers. So that's what should be being done. But what's a proper failure rate? You know, like Federal Pacific had a 60% failure rate of all their products, but I'm sure that there's a failure rate of 1% of most manufacturers out there. I'm sure that anybody that's a wire manufacturer, they get wire that shows up on reels where there's nicks and scratches and whole parts of the roll that's just messed up from the manufacturing process. It happens, but it's on the company to do the due diligence to be checking their products to make sure that there's no flaws when they're sending these things out to customers. And a lot of companies like Connecticut Electric, with their replacement breakers that they make for Federal Pacific panels, their audit process is set up so that if they notice any problems, they will actually re-engineer parts to make sure that their materials go out and address any of the problems. And that's not to say that there's anything wrong with these companies and their products. That's good auditing that they're doing, like any manufacturer is going to do or should do when their products are coming out and they find oh crap, okay, well, we notice there's this stupid little problem that some of these have. So let's just go to the drawing board, let's create a new piece of plastic that's shaped a different way or something and put it in there. And now we'll remanufacture everything going forward from this basis. But that's the manufacturing process. So a lot of people don't really realize the manufacturing process is kind of a muddy process in that you're constantly changing and evolving with what's going on with your product lines. Nothing is ever perfect, and it's constantly something that has to be monitored. The problem with Federal Pacific is that they weren't doing that. You know, they had a design, they just let shit get pumped out. They heard there was a problem, they just kept that faucet wide open and just kept letting things go out. Now, usually in manufacturing, if there's a large enough problem, you'll see what's called a recall. So a lot of, brakes for Toyota cars back in the day, or a lot of I have a Nissan Titan, the rear main seal on my specific year model of Titan. There was a huge recall because there was just so many problems that happened that they didn't notice, because not everything happens with a product right up front that you know about. A lot of stuff doesn't happen until a few years down the line, till this product's been in operation and being used, and then all of a sudden the weak link shows. And so it'll show down the line, and then you have to do a recall because you realize there's so many products that had this one thing that your auditing process or your manufacturing process missed. but that's a normal thing. That's okay. And in fact, Square D, Schneider Electric, actually owns one of the companies that makes replacement breakers for these Federal Pacific panels. It's specifically the Federal Pacific panels for Canada. I almost said Canada. For Canada, and it's Federal Pioneer. That's the name of their company. So they actually had to do a huge recall on some of their products because they noticed with the breakers, the replacement breakers that they were making for Federal Pacific, Canadian panel boards, that there was a problem, and it was large enough that they made a recall and fixed that problem. But I think the most interesting thing to think about is that all products are going to have some kind of failure rate. I think. Maybe not all products, but I think that it's at least logically acceptable or reasonable that there should be a certain amount of products that are just going to have flaws. Things are going to happen. And I don't know what percentage that is. And I'm kind of curious from any of you that are like in engineering or manufacturing, what is an appropriate amount or failure rate? Is it like less than 1%? Is it like 10%? You know, if like 10% of Square D's breakers don't work, are we going to be happy with that? Or at what point are we going to start hearing about problems? You know, if it's less than 1%, we're probably not even going to be hearing about a problem. But anyways, I thought that was rather interesting because UL as an agency doesn't care about the failure rate. All UL cares about to maintain your listing, to either be denied your listing or to get approved for a listing, is that you have a test procedure and you're manufacturing to this standard. Manufacturing, not having a certain failure rate. It's not about how good your products are, it's do they fit and adhere to the standard, and that's really all that's cared about. So to get your listing taken away means you have to be violating the listing, but that's the only way you get your listing taken away. All right, so let's talk about replacement breakers. So ever since 2002, there are other companies that have come across that have started to make replacement breakers. Some of them were just literally taking these breakers and putting different stickers on them, and it was the same exact breakers. There's a lot of shady stuff that was going on. Then some people were recreating the same breakers, but they weren't changing anything, so they were technically new, but they weren't to a new UL standard. The current breakers that are in production right now that are new, like brand new off the production line replacement breakers, are from Schneider Electric and from Connecticut Electric. Connecticut Electric makes the ones that are from the US Federal Pacific Systems, and then the Canadian-based Federal Pacific Systems, which is Federal Pioneer from Schneider Electric. Just a little bit different branding essentially, but that's who makes those. Now, my whole 2 cents on the matter, should you be replacing these or should you just be replacing the entire panel? That's the argument, right? That's what everybody is going to have bones about. I personally think that these panels are dangerous as they are, regardless if you're sticking new breakers in them or not. I think that the general populace of electricians out there, or anybody in the know about the situation, is right in saying that we just need to be replacing these. If you come up to a house that has one, first thing to do is to warn the customer and say, hey, just in case you're not aware, you have a Federal Pacific panel. These things have a history of massive failure rates. A lot of times the breakers don't even work, so it is kind of endangering your lives. And if they want to replace the breakers or the panel, and they do have the money to do all that, I think that that is the appropriate course of action. That's what we need to be teaching everybody as a message throughout our industry. So the second part of that, which I think is also a good qualifier, a good stance to take, is using replacement breakers is better than using existing breakers. So if they can't afford to have an entirely new service replaced and have all the arc fault and all the dual function breakers in and surge protection and proper grounding and bonding and all this stuff that you're going to have to upgrade, that an inspector is going to come out and inspect a new service, if they can't do that, replacing breakers is an okay thing to do. I think it's the next best step. Now, there is some research out there. Dr. Ehrenstein in his write-up said that the UBI breakers, which is the Connecticut Electric version of the breakers, and some of the Schneider stuff, still has problems. There still is a failure rate. It seems like the failure rate is a lot lower, but it also depends on what publications you refer to. There are people out there quoting that that these actually have more of a failure rate, and then there's people saying that they are far, far less. So you just have to look into all of this research, look into all of Dr. Ehrenstein's stuff, see what he says about it. go and do your own tests maybe. I've actually thought about getting something set up so that I can test brand new breakers and just see at 100, 130, and 200 and show what I am finding, because I think the only person that's released any kind of results about this stuff is Dr. Ehrenstein. So not that I would ever try to refute him. Very respected person in the industry, very knowledgeable, but I would like to see for myself. So maybe that will be for a video to come. But I think it is valid. I had a Zinsco panel on my house. So I took all of the old Zinsco breakers out, put all brand new Connecticut Electric replacements in. Everything worked just fine. I shorted out, a whole bunch of my circuits just to test and make sure all the breakers tripped. Granted, that was Zinsco, not the same thing as Federal Pacific, but it just goes to show that using replacement breakers is a valid option, and it is a better option than using these, which are literally from the 60s, 70s, 80s, whatever. These are the problem. This is the 60% failure rate breakers. These are not. So I still do think that there is a validity in this. If you have one breaker that you're trying to replace, put one of these in rather than grabbing one of those out of the shop. A lot of electricians hang on to those when he tears, like panels out of houses, because you might have that one service call like way out in the middle of the boonies in the middle of the night or something, and you just need to have one of them on your truck because old granny, whatever she's doing in the middle of the night, she needs to have her like microwave or whatever working. So you just have to use those. But now you don't have to, because they actually make these. They're in Home Depot. You can order them from bigelectricsupply.com. There's a link in the description below. But I think it is a viable option as well. So yes, number one, always try to replace these. We just need less of these systems out in the world today. But if you can't replace them, there are valuable options. There are breakers that you can replace them with. All right, my friends, that is all I have to say on the matter. There will be more of these coming up. I'm going to do one on Zinsco. I'm going to do one on Pushmatic, one on Challenger, and one on Wadsworth in the next few months. So look forward to that. Another thing, you guys need to start watching my videos on Fridays. So I know I've only been doing videos Mondays and Wednesdays usually. Now I'm doing Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So every Friday I do a video. Every other of those Fridays is a live where I sit and just go through all of your chat questions, everything, answer a whole bunch of stuff. It's usually like an hour long. And then the off Fridays, I do a Q&A, which is pre-recorded. So I'm going to do one right after this, where I just go through comments for like an hour and I just try to answer a whole bunch of stuff pre-recorded and put your guys' little message and your little avatars on screen and everything. So anyways, make sure you're watching Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Monday, Wednesday, Thursday. Make sure that you follow me on TikTok. That's a new thing. So I've been doing TikTok lives. I've been trying to grow my presence on TikTok. Join me on TikTok, join me in Discord, join me on Reddit, join me on Facebook, go to Twitter, all of the places, like, subscribe, notify, all of the stuffs. Love you, crazy fuckers. See you in the next one.
Best canned music and video.